Shabbat Shalom. Shabbat Shalom, everyone. We'll keep having people slip in and out here. I know we're having a few internet issues for those of you latecomers who may have joined recently on the Zoom. Best to keep your camera in the off setting so that you're not projecting your video image as I am. That'll keep it down to a point where we hopefully can broadcast well. Those of you on Zoom, you don't need to change anything. I hope that the strength of the phone signal will be enough today because there's no actual Wi-Fi at the shul. We're using a rigged hotspot courtesy of Reb Emanuel's phone and Michael's ingenuity. And we thank them. We also thank everyone who comes and helps to make this service possible. God knows his servants. So I'm going to start with a little humor here. Sometimes lately I've had some sermons without any humor at all, and it's kind of not my style. So I'm going to open with some humor. I find that it's this particular humorous tale happens to connect with the message today about divine purpose. There was a descendant of Pharaoh, and he learned that he was going to die, and he called his chaplain, his doctor, and his lawyer to his room. And he told the three of them that he wanted to be buried in the style of his ancestors and to be buried with some of his wealth. And he hands them each an envelope and says, in this envelope is $30,000. I want you to slip this in my casket before I am buried. They each agree to honor his request. A few weeks later, he dies, and the three men come and place envelopes in the casket before it's lowered into the ground. And after a beautiful ceremony, the three men walk around the cemetery together. The chaplain starts crying, and he says, I have to confess, I felt strongly that he was going to hell for being so concerned about money, and so I used $10,000 to help build an orphanage in his name. The envelope that I had only had $20,000. The doctor said, I too must confess, I donated $15,000 to find a cure for his disease so that others like him could live. My envelope only had $15,000 in it. The lawyer looked indignant and said to them, I can't believe the both of you that you would spend his money like that and not honor his wishes. My envelope had a personal check for the full amount of $30,000. Our Parsha today is called Miketz. Miketz means at the end. There seems to be a connection with ketz and endings, such as an eschatological possible meaning of end times. It's somehow built in there. And I'm not going to get too deep in that today, but we're going to go through some things together. This Parsha, Miketz, if you read it, it goes from Genesis 41, verse 1 through 44:17, I believe. And it tells of Joseph's interpretation of Pharaoh's dreams. At the opening of the Parsha, Joseph's already in prison. And the events transpire, and then he gets called out of prison. He interprets Pharaoh's dreams. Deals with Joseph's rise to power in Egypt and Joseph's testing of his brothers. There's one commentary from FFOZ, and it states, the late first century compendium of instructions to Gentile believers entitled the Didache says, accept the things that happen to you as good, knowing that apart from God, nothing comes to pass. That's the Didache 3, verse 10. Similarly, Paul says in Romans 8:28, we know that God causes all things to work together for good to those who love God, to those who are called according to his purpose. Now, this can be compared to the story of a rabbi from the days of the apostles named Nachum. Everyone called him Nachum, this too. Nachum, this too, is what they called him. Because no matter what happened, he would always say, this too is for good. Amazingly, God honored his faith by continually providing miracles for Nachum. And once it happened that Nachum, this too, was serving as an ambassador to Rome. And he was presenting the Roman emperor with a gift from the people of Judea in an attempt to ask him to reversing some anti-Jewish legislation. While en route to Rome, he stopped at an inn. And while he slept, the innkeeper stole the precious treasures meant for the emperor from Nachum's chest and replaced them with sand. Nachum went to Rome unaware that he was carrying a box of sand. And when the emperor opened the chest and saw the sand, he ordered Nachum to be put to death. Nachum simply replied, this too is for the good. Just then, Elijah the prophet appeared in the guise of a Roman officer and suggested that perhaps the sand was magic sand. The emperor agreed to test the theory, and indeed, when his troops hurled the sand at their enemies, they prevailed in battle. The emperor immediately released Nachum, reversed his decree against the Jews, and rewarded Nachum with a great wealth. The story of Nachum, this too, is a good illustration of the Joseph story. Like Nachum, this too, Joseph refused to be pushed around by life's circumstances. Instead, he looked to God for strength and encouragement and kept on believing. Some of you may remember a name, and to some of you today, this name will be strange and you won't recognize it. But there was a 20th century comedian named Milton Berle, who was known as, Mr. Television, also called Uncle Milty. And he was so far back in movies, in motion pictures, that when he started, they were silent films. That's how far back he went. He passed away in 2002. And he had written a poem that went like this, that I'd like to share with you. It says, I'd rather be a could-be if I cannot be an are, because a could-be is a maybe who is reaching for a star. I'd rather be a has-been than a might have been by far, for a might have been has never been, but a has was once an are. I wonder if anyone realizes that God says that you can be a could-be. As Milton Berle had said, a could-be is a maybe who is reaching for a star. And it reminds me of a New Covenant writing by Paul in Ephesians chapter 2 that says, for we are his workmanship, created in Messiah Yeshua for good deeds, which God prepared beforehand so we might walk in them. God is saying that once you became a believer, you became a could-be. God said you could be capable of doing mighty things because God had prepared good works just for you. There were things he had prepared for you long before you ever decided to walk with him. I once read a great quote that said this: God's plans aren't just for pie in the sky when you die. It's also for steak on your plate while you wait. Now that's a bit of an oversimplification, but the fact of the matter is God does have a plan for our lives. He has a plan for your life. He has a plan for my life. He does have a plan. And that brings us to our Parsha today. God had a plan for Joseph's life. God gave Joseph a couple of dreams that helped Joseph to realize that God planned to do that one day to make him into a great man. He knew from the very onset, even when he didn't understand the dreams, his brothers certainly understood, his parents understood, Jacob understood. They understood that he was saying that they would one day bow down to him. And Joseph shared these dreams with his family, and it didn't go over very well, obviously. And he told them of the dream where his brother's sheaves of wheat bowed down to him. And he told another dream where there were 11 stars and the sun and the moon, an obvious reference to his brothers and his father and his mother, and how they all bowed down to him. And Joseph had no clue what they meant exactly or precisely, but he was excited to know that God had a purpose for his life. That's divine purpose. I noticed something interesting. That there are 50 chapters in the book of Genesis. Joseph and his dreams are introduced in chapter 37. That means that the last 13 chapters of Genesis, a quarter of the book, were dedicated to Joseph's life. Nobody else in Genesis gets that much attention. Not even Noah, not Abraham, not Jacob, nobody. Of course, the question that I started to ask myself, why does Joseph get so much attention in the book of Genesis? Why is so much of it dedicated to him? About him? Why would God spend so much time on the story of Joseph? My conclusion was that Joseph received all this attention because he was a pivotal, or the pivotal character in the story of Israel. People would say, no, Jacob's the pivotal story. Not so. If not for Joseph, there would be no Israel. They would have died in the famine. God uses Joseph to save Israel. Not my opinion. It's right in the scriptures. When his brothers come to him and he reveals himself to him and he says he's not angry with them, he understood that this was God's purpose for him. That he went through all those hardships and sufferings so that he could save them. It was God's purpose. It was because Joseph that his family moved down to Egypt. It was because of Joseph that they were given an isolated section of Egypt to live in, an area called Goshen. It was by God's design that Israel was placed in this land of Goshen, and it was an isolated and out-of-the-way location for Israel to raise their flocks and herds. However, rather than skipping over that text as simply a location, there's some things to notice about its importance. You see, this isolated region, if you look on a Bible map, you'll see its proximity to Egypt's capital at the time, where Pharaoh's palace and all that was. But you'll see it was isolated by the various hills and valley in the area. So it was kind of encircled. And it was as if God placed them safely behind the walls of Egypt's power. It was a place where no other nation could attack them, a place where no other government or religion could influence them. Israel was even isolated from the influence of Egypt itself because the Egyptians detested being near to livestock. They wouldn't go anywhere near them. Genesis 46 verse 34 will tell you that. And it was in that secluded and protected area, in that land, that God grew the people of Israel into a mighty nation, a people that God had decided what he was going to do with them, even though they may not have understood it. They originally came there because there was no food anywhere else. And, God then grew Israel into a potential army of over 1 million who could then be powerful enough to take the land of promise. And Joseph was the man God chose to make it happen, not anyone else. Not Jacob, not any one of their other sons, not Pharaoh, nobody else, not some prophet that would come, with power in his stick. Nope. Joseph. It was all going to happen with him. Why would it matter whether we understood why God used Joseph to shape the destiny of Israel? Why does that even matter? Because there are teachers out there who would warp this story to meet their own agenda. I can't go through this. By the way, I've never taught, or I've never given a sermon, I should say, on this Parsha before. Ever. And the reason being is because for the last 20 years, the Parsha Miketz has always coincided with the holiday of Hanukkah. And so when it's Hanukkah, you talk about Hanukkah and not Miketz. Every year we skip over it. So for the first time in all my years of leading congregation, of giving sermons, the first time I'm doing this, and I cannot skip over this fact. If I don't warn you, I will be held responsible. You see, there are people out there who teach a twisted message known as prosperity theology. These people teach their followers that if you are spiritual enough, God will supply all your needs and you will become healthy, wealthy, and wise beyond all imagination. But the flip side of that teaching is that if you are not spiritual enough, you will be sickly, poor, and not too bright. And some of the Jewish people in the first century had fallen into that trap. They believed that wealth was the reward God gave to the faithful, and that if a person was wealthy, they obviously had done something right with God. So, when Messiah Yeshua told his followers that it was easier for a camel to go through the eye of a needle than for the rich to enter into heaven, they were against him. If the rich couldn't make it into heaven, what chance did they have? Prosperity teachers feed on this mindset. They basically teach their audiences that God is some kind of celestial slot machine, and all you have to do, they say, is push the right buttons, pull the right levers, and God will pour out so many earthly blessings upon you that it will make your head spin. Often, the buttons they encourage you to push are the buttons on your phone to dial in your special donation to their ministry. There's one I saw on TV a couple of years ago. I couldn't believe it. I was astounded that it was even allowed. And this guy is telling you that there's a tiny little packet, like that you kind of tear, like the size of a ketchup packet or something around there, and there was filled with so-called holy water, and then the testimonies of people that when they donated and prayed with that ministry, and they got that little packet and opened it, and I don't know what they do with it. Do they drink it? They put it on themselves? I don't know what they do with it. They send it to the water, and then it says immediately, 1 week later, I received the check from such and such a place for $27,000. And the other one says, and I was hired at a job for $200,000 a year. And now, I don't know if it's true, it's lies, I don't know, but it seems to me like a charlatan in a tent. Let me be perfectly clear here. Prosperity teachers are heretics. They are false teachers. They are heretics who give you not the good news, but the fake news. Can I be any more clear about it? The fact that God has a plan for your life is not about us using God to get what we want. That is a very bad, and it's a misunderstanding of our purpose and God's purpose for us. When God says he has a plan for your life, it's not about him giving you an earthly estate and a Maserati or Tesla in your garage or a huge swimming pool in your backyard. Not that there's anything wrong with that. But when God says he has a plan for your life, that's not what he's offering. What God is offering, what he's offering to you, what he's offering to me, what he's offering to everyone who trusts him, is a chance to be honored by him. A chance to partner with him in a covenant relationship, a faithful relationship. And when God says he has a plan for you, he's saying he has a plan to make you useful to him. He's going to give you meaning in your life. He's going to give you a reason to live on, a reason to exist, a reason to be a could be. Just like God had a plan for Joseph's life, God has a plan for your life too. And that's the good news. And now for the bad news. Sometimes in order for you and I to be useful to God, God might have to take us through a time of, let's call it training. A time to shave off the rough edges and hone our attitudes to his purposes. Some might call this training the school of hard knocks. In the story of Joseph, God no sooner gives Joseph his dreams than his brother get him off by himself, beat the tar out of him, and throw him in a pit and sell him into slavery. And for more than a decade, Joseph was a slave and a prisoner. And that isn't right. And that's not fair. And that should never have happened. And yet it did. And where was God while all this was happening to him? Well, Genesis chapter 39 verse 2 tells us, but Adonai was with Joseph, so he became a successful man in the house of his master, the Egyptian. And in 39 verse 5 it says, Adonai blessed the Egyptian's house because of Joseph. And then in verse 21 of Genesis 39 it says, but Adonai was with Joseph and extended kindness to him and gave him favor in the eyes of the commander of the prison. You see, all this time that Joseph was in slavery and in prison, God was right there with him. He's molding Joseph. He's training him. He's teaching him. And it is only through hardship and difficulty and trial and sometimes near-death experience that actually shocks us and shakes us out of our mold, out of our bad thinking. God's hand was right there guiding Joseph. It's right here guiding us. Everything that Joseph had to endure was all part of God's plan because God was training this young man to become a great leader. God tells us that that's what he does with us as well. As Paul writes in Romans chapter 5, he says, we also rejoice in our sufferings, knowing that suffering produces perseverance, and perseverance, proven character, and proven character, hope. And hope does not disappoint us. Does that mean that every time we suffer, that God brought it to pass? That God caused us to suffer? No, not always. But what Paul was telling us in Romans was that when we have suffered, whether God brought it into our lives or not, that God could use that suffering to shape and mold us. You know, there's this interesting story about a little boy visiting with his grandmother. And he talked on and on, as little boys are prone to do, telling his grandma how everything was going wrong in his life. He had difficulties at school, family problems, health issues, not enough toys, and on and on. Meanwhile, Grandma was baking a cake. In the midst of his tale of woe, she asked the child if he would like a snack, which of course he did. Here, have some cooking oil. Yuck, says the boy. How about a couple of raw eggs? That's gross, Grandma. Would you like some flour then? Or maybe baking soda. Grandma, those are all yucky. To which Grandma replies, yes, I guess they are. In fact, those things seem bad all by themselves, but when you combine them together in the right way, they make a wonderfully delicious cake like the one I'm making now. And you know, God works in our lives in that same way. All these yucky, hard things we would call bad things, God piles up, works together, blends them together, and remakes us into who we need to be. Moses would have never been the man he was until he walked 40 years in the wilderness, until he walked through the desert and almost died, until he became a shepherd. The prince of Egypt becomes a shepherd, a lowly, lowly shepherd. God had to train him. He had to train David. He had to train Joseph. He's got to train us. God gave Joseph an exciting dream. And then God guided Joseph through these years of hardship and difficulty. And do you suppose that, did you ever think whether or not Joseph was okay with it? Was he okay with that hardship? That he simply sat back and took it all in stride? I don't think so. Consider the example of the names that he gave to his own two sons. Genesis chapter 41, verses 51 and 52. Joseph called the firstborn Manasseh, meaning causing to forget. Because God has caused me to forget all the troubles I suffered at the hands of my family. Doesn't sound like he was taking it in stride to me. Verse 52. The second he called Ephraim, meaning fruit. For God has made me fruitful in the land of my misfortune. He didn't look back and go, yeah, that was good. Woo! Every person should spend a few years in prison. Yeah, that was great. Not a chance. The years Joseph spent in slavery and prison, isolated from his family and friends of his youth, how on earth did Joseph handle it? Well, he determined to face every situation in the same way. He determined to always be God's man, no matter what he had to endure. He may not have been happy in his situation, and God is not asking us to be happy in ours. But Joseph made himself useful to those in authority over him, regardless in whatever situation he was in. And in every situation he found himself in, Joseph was the best man of God he could possibly be. Let me ask you this. Have you ever had a job where the boss was kind of a jerk and your coworkers were nearly impossible to get along with, and you wondered, how are you going to get out of there? How would you, as a Yeshua follower, deal with that? Well, if you were like Joseph, you would try to be the best possible man or woman of God you could be in that situation. You would try to obey Messiah's words in Matthew 5:16, where Yeshua says, let your light shine before men so they may see your good works and glorify your Father in heaven. How could you do this? You would do it for the same reason that Joseph honored God in his situations as a slave and a prisoner, because you trust God. And that comes before any situation in life. Hebrews 11:6 tells us that without faith it is impossible to please God. For the one who comes to God must believe that he exists and that he is the rewarder of those who seek him. Joseph not only believed that God was there, but he believed that God was watching and that God would reward him for his faith in him. You know, back in Genesis 39, we're told about Joseph's slavery and unjust imprisonment, and one phrase shows up over and over again. Adonai was with Joseph. Adonai was with him. Whatever he did, Adonai made it succeed. The whole 39th chapter of Genesis is laced with a repeated drumbeat of the same statement over and over, declaring that Joseph trusted God and God was with him. guiding him every step of the way. You see, that's what the story is really all about. A lot of people look at this story of Joseph and think what a great bedtime story it is for kids. And that's okay. But that's not why it was written. That's not why we're reading it today. And that's not what God wants us to get out of this. You see, Joseph's story was written for you and for me. Joseph's story was told in the Torah of Moses, in the Sefer Bereshit, the book of Genesis, because God wanted Joseph to be a poster child for godly men and women. Romans 15:4 tells us that for whatever was written before was written for our instruction, so that through patience and the encouragement of the scriptures, we might have hope. We look at the story of Joseph and say, what does it have to do with me thousands of years later? It has everything to do with us, because the scriptures are given to us for our instruction, to teach us, to train us. Granted, in the end, Joseph got an earthly mansion, a really cool chariot, and maybe even a yacht on the Nile. But he got a beautiful wife and 2 children of blessing and a position of great importance. And now a prosperity teacher could have a field day with this story. But that's not what the story is all about. In fact, that's never been what the scripture has been all about. Hebrews 11 is the hall of fame of the faithful. And we're told in Hebrews 11:32-40, it says, "And what more shall I say? For time would fail me if I tell of Gideon, Barak, Samson, Jephthah, and of David and Samuel and the prophets. By faith they conquered kingdoms, administered justice, obtained promises, shut the mouths of lions, quenched the power of fire, escaped the edge of the sword, and were made strong out of weakness, became mighty in war, and made foreign armies flee. And women received their dead, raised back to life." But then, because the Bible never lies to us, we're told also, as it continues, others were tortured after not accepting release so they might obtain a better resurrection. Others experienced the trial of mocking and scourging, yes, even chains in prison. And they were stoned, and they were sawed in two, and they were murdered with the sword. And they went around in sheepskins and goatskins. And they were destitute, afflicted, mistreated. The world was not worthy of them. And they wandered around in deserts and mountains, caves and holes in the ground. And all these, though commended for their faith, did not receive what was promised, because God had provided something better for us, so that only with us would they reach perfection. In other words, being faithful to God doesn't always yield earthly peace and prosperity. But being faithful does yield a life that is meaningful and fulfilling. It makes us into the people of whom the world is not worthy. In Judaism, a good deed is like giving charity to the needy. It's called a mitzvah. The plural form is mitzvot. The word mitzvah literally means commandment. And every time we keep one of God's commandments, it's a good deed. And therefore, the word mitzvah has come to be associated with an act of goodness. Our opportunities to do mitzvot are limited to our lifetime on earth. Yeshua teaches that our mitzvot, our good deeds, are like money placed into savings accounts in heaven. When we pass on to the next life, we will be able to cash in on the mitzvot we have stored up in heaven. And the world says, you can't take it with you, but the Messiah says, oh yes, you can. I want to close with the story of one man who God rewarded in a powerful way. It's a story of a man who gained great wealth, but it's more the story of a man who believed in a God who was the rewarder of those who seek him. Years ago, a man over 60 was offered nearly $200,000 for a restaurant, motel, and service station because he had spent his life building it up. He turned down the offer because he loved the business and wasn't ready to retire yet. And there are those who would have said he should have taken that offer. And the state ended up building a new highway that bypassed the business, and he lost it. At the age of 65, he was flat broke with just a small Social Security check each month. What was he to do? There was one thing he knew how to do. He knew how to fry chicken. Maybe he could sell that knowledge to others. So he kissed his wife goodbye, and he left in their battered old car with a pressure cooker, a can of specially prepared flour, and he set out to sell his idea to other restaurants. He often slept in the car because there wasn't enough money for a hotel room. Years later, he was a multi-millionaire. Do you know who he was? Colonel Sanders. Now, there are those who believe his success was based on his tenacity and perseverance and having the right product at the right time. But that's not the whole story. The rest of the story is that Colonel Sanders was a godly man who had made a vow to God that he would give 50% of his income to charity. He gave constant gifts and endowments to colleges, as well as paying tuition and book fees for young students. One person once observed, Colonel Sanders proved that true wealth is measured by what we do and by who we serve. My point here is this. Wealth wasn't Colonel Sanders' driving force. He was first and foremost God's man, and his desire was to please God in what he had been entrusted with. And for people like you and I, we need to realize that serving God is not about what God can do for us, but rather what we can do with God. The wealthiest and most powerful people in this world find no real meaning in their lives, and much of what they accomplish disappears after they die. But not so with us. If we do what God has dreamed for us to do, what we do will last for all eternity. And one day we'll stand before God and hear the words, "Well done, my good and faithful servant." John F. Kennedy, the 35th President of the United States, in his inaugural speech said, "Ask not what your country can do for you, ask what you can do for your country." Perhaps it was just too many years ago. Perhaps over a period of 60 years or so, that means different things for us. But now God is saying to you and I, ask not what God can do for you, but ask what you can do with God. So you can continue to be fooled by prosperity teachers, which leads people to emptiness and self-pity when they don't get the promised millions. Or you can have that Joseph kind of faith, trusting that God is with you and will see you through whatever tough times you may face. God got Joseph through years of slavery and prison while preparing him for a divine purpose. And God can and will do miracles for you and me, and for everyone who trusts in him. So trust him. Trust in God and the divine purpose he has for your life. God has a plan for your life. It may be filled with rocky roads, but that can be exactly what you don't want, but maybe just what you need to mold you into the servant he wants you to be. King Solomon the Wise wrote in Proverbs 3, "Trust in Adonai with all your heart, and lean not on your own understanding, but in all your ways acknowledge him, and he will make your paths straight." And he also wrote in Proverbs 19, verse 21, "Many are the plans in a person's heart, but it is the Lord's purpose that prevails." There's an old Yiddish proverb. Man plans and God laughs. His purpose prevails. Maybe it's time now, finally now, today, this moment, that we could really, really, really become that could be that he wants us to be. And that we could trust in his plan for your life. Trust his divine purpose for your life. Shabbat Shalom.